As with all of our webinars, you can find them on our website, pfps.org, under our advocacy page. Be sure to sign up for emails while you're there to get updates from our team, including about future webinars. During today's webinar, please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. I'm going to briefly introduce our esteemed panelists. Steve Seuss has served as an adjunct at the Institute for Liberal Arts at Emory University for over 20 years. He recently was Chief Strategist for Better Schools, Better Jobs, an education advocacy project of the New Venture Fund. He was founding director of the Alabama Civil Liberties Union and later served as executive director of the Southern Regional Council, as well as vice president at the Southern Education Foundation, where he once served with my boss. That's not in his official bio. Dr. Hampton grew up in Little Rock, Arkansas, and was a member of the second class of African-American students entering Little Rock Central High School in 1959. Dr. Hampton served as the third president of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, and she has an extensive and lauded background of service in a number of sectors, including K-12 and higher education, as well as philanthropy. I'll kick it to Steve to begin our discussion today. A reminder to drop your questions in the Q&A for the end.
Thank you, Catherine. That's I should put at the first line of my bio that I was once Catherine Dunn's boss. Thank everyone for joining us, and especially thanks to my old friend to whom I have co-dedicated this book, Sybil Hampton. Let me begin by having an overview of what the book says, and then Sybil and I are going to have a conversation about those themes, and then we're going to open it up for questions and answers. If you think about it, today private schools are the only places in the United States where white parents can predictably find a K-12 school that is virtually all white. Now, in this respect, very little has changed in private school enrollment since the decades following the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education, which outlawed public school segregation. What has vastly changed is this. In the years following Brown, only 7 southern states, led by segregationists, adopted voucher programs to finance largely unregulated private schools so that white children would not have to go to school with black children. Today, 26 states, including 10 southern states, have established programs for financing the same type of private school vouchers, and states together are annually spending now more than $2.2 billion a year, and that amount of funding is more than 13 states across the nation have in public funding for their own public schools. Now, the movement for public funding of private schools has been driven, as many of you know, in recent years through a concerted, well-financed campaign fueled by wealthy donors, including the current U.S. Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and her husband. This campaign often calls itself a social justice movement to provide low-income students, especially students of color, with a good education through school choice, while condemning what they call failing government schools that frequently are underfunded. In fact, the call for school choice today echoes the language of the Southern segregationists who called for freedom of choice to evade school desegregation. And today's advocates for school choice are employing many of the same arguments and many of the same tactics and strategies, including vouchers, that were the prime strategies of segregationists to overthrow the Brown decision. Now, I know in popular culture today, people like George Wallace is remembered as the South's leading segregationist. And many of you, like I do, vividly remember his stand in the schoolhouse door to prevent 2 African Americans from entering a university with over 10,000 white students. But the fact is, as the next slide shows, George Wallace was only one type of segregationist, and hardly the representative figure of those who were more successful segregationists in blocking school desegregation over time. There were other segregationists beyond the one in that image, whose backgrounds and styles differed considerably from George Wallace and people like Bull Connor. And it was the other segregationists who built the more lasting terms, tools, and tactics that have obstructed the Supreme Court's unanimous 1954 opinion. Now, it is true that the first formal Southern state plan to block desegregation after the Brown decision was developed in late 1954 here over in Alabama, primarily by 2 different types of segregationists. One was Senator Albert Boutwell, a moderate segregationist who, by the way, later replaced Bull Connor in Birmingham as its mayor, and a segregationist corporate lawyer, brilliant corporate segregationist named Forney Johnstone. Their segregationist plan proposed a freedom of choice, as they called it, without regard to race. Freedom of choice without regard to race. And as the next slide shows, it had 4 basic components. First, the plan eliminated any prohibition or any mention of segregation. It allowed, as it said, mixed schools and enshrined freedom of choice for the parents. The second, it removed the right of education from its constitution and established a policy of fostering education according to available resources and the ability of individual students. And who did those segregationists think had ability as students? Third, it enabled local officials to decide eligibility and admission and allocation of pupil placement, including refusing admission of students according to their deficiencies might compel lowering of school standards. And finally, the 4th component was providing vouchers and other tax funds for support of private schools who could do all the above without government approval or oversight. Now, these 4 propositions actually were adopted in one form or another by 6 other states that followed Alabama's approach by assigning pupil placement in public schools according to their notion of children's ability to learn, and by funding private academies where segregationist white leaders could establish all white admission standards on their own. Now, as the next slide shows, shortly after the Boutwell-Johnstone plan was publicized, libertarian economist Milton Friedman published his first article calling for an end to government schools, as he called them, a term echoed by presidents in recent days, and a system of vouchers so that parents could send children to the schools of their choice. Now, Friedman knew that the segregationists were calling for the same voucher programs that he was proposing, and that they thought that it would upend the Brown decision. But Milton Friedman thought school choice was more important than ending school segregation. And so he said his system would allow there to be exclusively white, exclusively colored, exclusively mixed schools. Parents could choose where to send their children. One of the consequences of Milton Friedman's endorsement of school choice was that it gave segregationists a new economic rationale and cover for what they already were attempting to do and promote the same methods by which to do it. Luckily, the federal courts were not taken in. And by the end of the 1960s, the federal courts had ruled that most of the South's voucher programs were a violation of the U.S. Constitution's equal protection provision. And by then, much had already been done. A substantial amount of local and state resources, including voucher funding, had already been transferred to private schools that enabled them to rapidly grow across the South and in other locations across the country. These schools, make no mistake about it, these schools were uniformly segregated, but many began to provide a non-racial reasons for their practices, often based on the notions of serving students, again, according to the ability of the individual student to learn. For example, in 1972, the head of the segregated Alabama Independent School Association said that it wasn't segregation. Our primary interest, he said, is in educating people basically of like learning capacities. And who had the like learning capacities? Only white students. Most of these segregated schools survived and many thrived. And using the federal tax deduction as a replacement for vouchers, they continued. When the federal law against racial discrimination eventually began to endanger this tax benefit, private schools in and outside the South increasingly admitted a token number of students of color, oftentimes Chinese, Japanese, or Indian students. In this way, private schools remained virtually segregated by race, but continued to receive tax benefits. Now, as this political movement continued, as the next slide shows, the concept of token integration and virtual segregation became, token desegregation and virtual education became the same. And as this ad for the Central Alabama Academy shows, it was not just an advertisement for a segregated school in the 1970s, but a college preparatory, Christian-oriented, non-sectarian, non-profit, private school organization, parent-owned and parent-operated. This merger of religion, of segregation, became an operating principle for many private schools. It was endorsed by President Ronald Reagan, who presented the first presidential message endorsing school vouchers as a federal education policy. Luckily, it did not pass at that time. Well, as that political movement for school choice quietly spread across state capitals during the last 3 decades, the fact is the old patterns of racial exclusion in private schools have hardly changed. As the next slide shows, as recently as 2012, 2/3 of all white students in U.S. private schools attended virtually exclusionary schools. And those were schools where African Americans, Hispanic, and Native American students comprised 10% and often much less than 10% of the enrolled population. Now, what we need to understand is, as the next slide shows, the image of private segregated schools today looks innocent enough. We don't have George Wallace standing at the schoolhouse door. But if you look at those images, first on the top one of the Charlotte Christian School senior class, and at the bottom, the Scottsdale, Arizona Christian Academy elementary grade class, that is the image of private schooling in most places in the United States today. It certainly is not the image of angry white students standing around Central High School as they did in Little Rock in 1957. But that image is no less an image of how Brown versus the Board of Education is being overturned. As the next slide shows, this nation is at risk today of establishing and advancing publicly financed system of virtual segregation and exclusion in our education that was the aim of Southern segregationists. We already have a majority of the states that have erected the scaffolding of this national system of publicly financing private schools that are exclusionary. We must not allow Brown to become a museum artifact, only to see as something that once was our promise. As Justice Thurgood Marshall wrote, Justice Thurgood Marshall wrote in 1974 in an important dissent on the school case, unless our children begin to learn together, there is little hope that our people will ever learn to live together. It is that simple and that profound. Don't you think, Sybil?
I do. I agree with you, Steve. Steve, do you think that it's important as this conversation moves forward to talk about virtual versus absolute segregation, to kind of clarify that, but also to speak about that in national terms, not just in Southern terms? Yes,
I do. You know, we think of Southern segregation as being an absolute bar of any person. And George Wallace, when he stood in the schoolhouse door, embodied that. 2 students in a university of 10,000 white kids, he wanted an absolute segregation. But the fact is, in the South and in other parts of the nation, absolute segregation was not the definition of segregation. It was virtual segregation. It was allowing a token number of non-whites to vote. The all-white primary actually had a token number of black folks who voted in the South. And in all the restrictions of segregation, there was always a class-based exception for some what was called in the 1960s the good Negro, and a slightly different term earlier in that era. The fact is, other places had this kind of segregation. What's interesting is if you were to go to Arizona back in the 1950s, what you would have found is that if the number of students in a school or a school district was beginning to get beyond a token number, then local white parents could petition to have a referendum in order to create absolute segregation. So in many ways, what we had was, on the law books in the South, absolute segregation, but an acceptance of virtual segregation. And in the West, especially, and some of the Midwest, Indiana for quite a while, what we had was the acceptance of virtual segregation until tokenism got out of hand and became more than tokenism. And that's when the laws enabled absolute segregation. But we had segregation across the nation, in law and in fact.
And Steve, one of the things I also think about in terms of the desegregation of the schools in Little Rock is that the pupil placement laws were enforced. And I remember very clearly literally spending months going through the hurdles of being interviewed, doing psychological testing, all of the kinds of things that pupil placement laws allowed that really were ways of discouraging students from being in the process. The process of being involved in a pupil placement system were quite arduous. And I feel that we might need to examine whether or not in the private school admission process, you have things that really resemble pupil placement laws.
I think that's right. I think, Sybil, you were able to be the second class to sustain desegregation at Central High School because you were a brilliant student. You had other qualities that allowed you to endure the indignities that you had to endure. But, Daisy Bates and others carefully selected you and other African-American students because the placement laws were such that they assumed that you were because you were African American, you were not able to have the aptitude of a white student, and you were there to prove them wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, in the short run, that's what had to happen. The pupil placement laws were under challenge, but they still were in place when you went into the second class at Central High School. But the profound proposition that those had is that it means that you track students according to what you perceive to be their ability. And in private schools, they don't track them, they simply reject them. In public schools, we've had a tradition. There are some school systems that still have an entrance exam based in large part on this whole notion that you allow a publicly funded system to decide who has like learning capacities. Well, the segregationists use that both in the short run and now their legacy in the long run to make sure that we don't have desegregated schools.
Yes, I think that the other thing about your book that was quite striking to me is that when we think of the icons of the civil rights struggle, and you think of the negative icons, George Wallace, that you are so fixated on that you miss the fact that there was something going on in the background that literally was much more important than anything that the people standing at schoolhouse doors did. And what are the implications for that, for what's going on in our society now, Steve, with education?
Yeah. It's exactly right, Sybil. And in Arkansas, I think as in the other southern states, everybody knew who the leading segregationists were. What we didn't know, and what many didn't at the time pay much attention to, is who were the segregationists who were actually shaping the practices and policies in schools to defeat Brown. And those were if you look at in the book, you'll see that they were all people of considerable standing in the white community. Some were like Forney Johnstone, were lawyers for major corporations in the country. Others were major landowners and people who had great respect in the business communities, the white business communities. Those folks believed that there was a way in which to achieve what George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door to protest. They were the ones who, in fact, found the strategies to make it happen in more places than not. And I think today we cannot simply look for the George Wallaces. As I tried to make the point on that picture of those innocent-looking white kids in those segregated schools of Charlotte and Scottsdale, those kids are victims as much as anyone else. But it's the policies and practices of the adults that put them in those places that we really have to examine and change.
And the role of free market economists and all of the people who are speaking about capitalism today, very wealthy Americans, we need you to help us to think more broadly about that, Steve.
Well, you know, what Milton Friedman has done is tell people that sending your child with public funds to a private school is a good, a decent, understandable consumer choice that has no implications for the broader society or for the morality of the matter. And this whole notion that somehow the decision to use a voucher to send your child to a private school has no other implication other than a consumer's choice of whether your child is to be educated. You know, that's provided a cover for a lot of things that have been going on that's very mischievous and wrong-headed. I think you know, we have to directly challenge the notion that education is both a private good, or that making individual private decisions about where to send a child does not have a broader ripple effect upon the entire community. It goes back to what that quote that you and I love, that I cited from Thurgood Marshall. If children do not learn together, how do we have a hope that our society will learn to live together? That's a pretty profound problem.
And just as profound is the fact that we are diverting public funds to private use and in institutions in which there's no oversight, that the public schools are accountable in many, many ways. They have to educate everybody who comes through their door, and the private schools are able to cherry pick, but also to have people leave if they don't fit.
Oh, yeah.
And I think
yeah, you know, I mean, let's be clear. Most of the private schools are religion-based. Most of the private schools are virtually segregated. Most of the private schools do not admit a student who has a sexual orientation that is not biblically based. It was fundamentally in the fundamental interpretation of the Bible. Private schools that are receiving public funds in most communities can make a decision to include and exclude students who are there through public funding for the most irrational, dangerous reasons, and are able to do it without anyone having recourse. That is not a public education system. And we've already built the scaffolding of this kind of Milton Friedman choice system in 26 states. That's dangerous.
Well, Stephen, your book does not speak to charter schools, but I think you should speak about charter schools and how that muddies the water.
Yeah, you know, I think I happen to believe that charter schools conceptually were not a bad notion, in the sense that if you had a school in which the public system attempted to find new ways in which all the different schools could learn how to teach and innovate in different ways, and to integrate that learning into but what's essentially happened is that charter schools have begun to be taken over in too many states by private profit-making corporations that see no such role. And I think most destructive is that certainly in the South and in most other parts of the country, the charter school movement has allied itself with the private school choice movement. And they are now in league together in most states in attempting to try to move away from a democratic school system to one in which private entities get to make decisions about the public funds that are supporting a private school. And in that sense, when I was at the Southern Education Foundation and Catherine and I were working together, I would suggest that one of us go down to the state capitol every year for what was called Choice Day at the Capitol. And when you go down there in Georgia and in other southern and other non-southern states, what we found and others would find is that the charter school buses were there bringing kids in support of choice legislation, which was as much in support of putting public funds into private hands as it was supporting, certainly wasn't supporting only public choice. Then what we've seen here is that we now have a charter school movement, and that makes it doubly dangerous.
Yes. Steve, the thing that I'm struck by is I know many wonderful people here in Little Rock and across the country who send their children to private schools and who really are liberal and who find themselves, who think of themselves as being progressive, and they have no idea that there are these dangers that your book points out, and that the public good is not being realized. How do we, without attacking people whose children are attending private schools, develop a stakeholder group so that the public good that needs to be done in our society for public education for those children who will never be in a private school and in fact won't be in a charter school? How do we spark that movement?
Well, I think first of all, we set up certain, I would suggest, Sybil, that what we need to do is set up certain fences. And the first fence I think that we don't want anyone to cross is the fence that even if you send your child to a private school, that school should not be receiving public funds, period. And I think we need to talk to the parents whose kids are going to private schools and acknowledge to them that they've made a choice, rightly or wrongly, for their own children. But the first point is that school should not be publicly funded unless it's going to observe the same restrictions and policies and governance that a public system has. And no private system has that. The second, I think, fence that we have to set up is the one which is the one that's more difficult, but it is that one that says, you know, we have to have alternatives in public schools, and we have to have a way in which to help all sorts of children learn, and that your role in your child's role in helping to achieve that community school is one that could make a difference in their lives and in others' lives. And I think we argue to them that in this world, one may become terribly efficient on an SAT score, but unless you're able to learn how to learn with others and to live with others, in this 21st century, your child is not going to get very far in creating a beloved community. So I think we take it, we don't draw one line, but we draw some lines to try to begin to move us away from a public financed private school system. And then once we've achieved that, then we can get back to what probably everybody on this call, or most folks on this call, know the simple fact, you and I know it, which is that we are having to spend so much time fighting to keep a public school system funding adequate, to keep the diversion of public funds away from the private schools, that none of us are able to spend the time that we need to be devoting to improving our public schools. The fact is, we just don't, I mean, when it's under attack with inadequate funding, there's not much time and effort to be innovative in the public schools as much as we'd want.
I would say to you that one of the things that has been most shocking to me living in this community and talking to people with children with different needs is to understand how disadvantaged disabled children are in this current system that is being hawked, whether it's charter schools, whether it's private schools, that there really are not the kinds of services nor the sensitivities and sensibilities around the needs of these children to be educated and to have opportunities to be the best they can be.
I think that's right. I mean, you know, there's fortunately it has not been able to receive any public funding, but you know, there was one school in Mississippi, for example, private school, which essentially said that its laying on of its hands by its minister was going to be how to deal with students with disabilities. I mean, that's an extreme example of a charlatan using their religion. But it's not it's a good example of the point you're making, I think, Sybil, which is that most of the private schools either are very specialized have a long history in providing specialized services to students with special needs. But the fact is that there are many more which simply say that they are able to provide services that their staff and their facility is simply incapable of providing. There was another example in Alabama where a private school said it was going to provide services for disabled students, and it wasn't even handicapped accessible.
I think that as we close our conversation and go to the Q&A, one of the things that makes me very hopeful at this time is that what has happened as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement and of the mass outpouring that we've seen of citizens coming to realize that what happens to people who look like me matters for more than just people who are Black, and that the pandemic also gives us an opportunity to see that we have so much in common and that we need to work not as individuals, but we need to work for the common good and get back the conversations in these United States of America about what life in these United States should mean for all of its citizens, and particularly the least of these.
Well, Sybil, that's why you're my friend and my mentor. I look to you for all of that kind of insight and inspiration.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you both so much for this really thoughtful and provocative discussion. We are getting a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to get to all of them, and I'll group a couple that are along similar themes. So we've got a couple of questions about the moment we're in with the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on education. William Mathis asks if COVID is going to exacerbate segregation through segregated pods, choice, homeschoolers, and lack of funding in our public schools. And then we have a question about whether schools' decisions about not reopening for in-person learning could bolster the argument that parents should have access to public funds, to the per-pupil funds, to find alternative learning options for their children. The attendee is curious if you share this concern and thoughts about responding to this push.
Yeah. Sybil, you want to go first?
No, I want you to go first on this. Okay.
I do think it's a dangerous time for public schools. You know, and so much of it has to do with the fact that we are simply moving into a way of providing education that is structurally inequitable. You know, but there are things we can do about it. Yes, the virtual learning could turn out to be exacerbate virtual segregation. But if we make sure that every household with a school-age child has internet service and has a device on which to work, that goes towards building that platform, an equal platform that public schools represent. I mean, school administrators and school teachers can tackle this problem. They can identify how to minimize the inequities that this may exacerbate. But what they can't do is provide the funding that enables that platform to exist. And that's where we have to come in. Those of us who've had children or still have children in the public schools have to come in and get that done for the educators. And with their protest and support as a part of it.
And are there, Steve, some organizations that you think are uniquely prepared to stand and to work, that people should work through these organizations? I believe that the timing is so important that there are some extant organizations that really are ready to be mobilized to work collaboratively and to provide leadership.
Yeah, well, I think the organization, the coalition who's sponsoring us today is a good one to start with. I think Derek Johnson, leading the NAACP, is very attentive to these school issues. Derek understood them when he was in Mississippi and fought hard for them. The NAA is a plaintiff in the case that the Southern Poverty Law Center and others have brought against the attempting to DeVos' attempt to divert funds to private schools. I think, you know, I don't think we need, as you were suggesting, Sybil, I don't think we need any new organizations to do this, but I think what we need is some leadership and support for those kind of organizations to simply lay out the agenda of what is the equity, necessities for equity to assure, we can't assure it, but that gives every child a good chance not to have their education governed by their lack of resources at home. There is another danger that I want to mention. I do think the private schools are going to be suggesting that they have a better track record at virtual education than the public schools. In fact, there are here in my own state of Georgia, there are private schools receiving tax credit scholarships who have been operating on what they call the university model, and that is that they have been having students come for 2 or 3 days a week to their campus, and then the other 2 or 3 days a week they are supporting homeschooling. And I think we have to be very careful to see that the mischief of our state legislatures do not begin to move in a direction where, under the cover of trying to deal with the challenges of virtual education, move to expand those folks who say they've got experience, but who've been working with largely all white student bodies, usually quite wealthy.
Thank you both. So we have a question about that gets back to the history of this fight and about how over time after Brown, we did see some achievement gap data improve in public schools. The integration policies start to erode after. So Lynn Edmonds notes this and asks your thoughts about this trend.
Well, I think it's a trend that's continued. When I was at the Southern Education Foundation, one of the presentations I did that had the most surprising response to people was that, and there's been additional data since then, showing that when it comes to low-income students, which is the majority of our students in the public schools, private schools are not doing as good a job as public schools at educating them. And this runs against all of the myths of private schooling, that private is always better because it's elitist. Well, because it is in fact because it's elitist that it is unable to understand how to manage the education of students who are not already well-to-do and well-off. So I think the evidence is clear, and I cite in one of the footnotes of my book some of the latest studies on showing that, in fact, what we've got is a public school system that's doing a much better job than the private schools are as a sector in educating the majority of our public school students, which are students of color and students who are low-income, from low-income families.
Thanks, Steve. We have 3 or 4 questions from folks about the recent Supreme Court decision in Espinoza versus Montana. Sybil was noting this might be a topic of discussion during our prep call. And Steve, I know you wrote a piece for Southern Spaces that draws on some of the themes in your books and thinking about what Espinoza means for the movement to keep public funds in public schools. So can you talk about kind of where we are now following Espinoza and your thoughts on the work we should be doing?
Well,
it's a question for both of you. Yeah.
Right. As I said earlier, what we have to come to grips with is that most of the private schooling in the United States is religion-based, and most of those schools are virtually segregated, exclusionary. And then the one, that's for anyone who watched the movement of segregated academies over the decades will understand how they embraced religion, and some of them thought religion was their motive for having segregation. They believed it was biblically ordained. What Espinoza says to us is that the Supreme Court of the United States, as presently constituted and probably soon for some time to come, has abandoned Thomas Jefferson's notion of the wall of separation between church and state. Instead, religious freedom, one of the other sections of the First Amendment, has now become a license for allowing the government to support religion in any and all ways that policymakers can come up with. There's hardly I read that decision bleakly, saying there's hardly anything that a mischievous legislature could do to support religious schooling that the legislature wouldn't allow and the court wouldn't permit. So what do we need to do? Well, what we need to do, I think, is realize the court cannot mandate policy. It may decide it's in keeping with the Constitution. But the policy of whether or not we support religious schools is a state policy that we can influence. And the fact is, we've got to get the state legislatures to become more democratic, more responsive to public education's needs than they have been. And that means, not just talking to people whose votes in the legislature you already know are going to be good, but going out and finding a constituency for those issues that we care about in districts where we need the votes to carry the day on public policy. We've so far been able to prevent the federal government from supporting private schooling in any major way. We've we've not been able to be very successful with 26 states. We need that focus, and the Supreme Courts can't, if we can get policies which says that we do not fund private schools, religion or not, Supreme Court will not be able to overturn that under any conception of the U.S. Constitution.
I'm not commenting, Catherine, because I think there are other questions that need to be addressed.
You're right, we have a lot to get to. We might not get to all of them, but we'll get to as many as possible. So another theme that's coming up in these questions, and Sybil, you brought this up a little bit during the discussion, but it's about the impact of vouchers on students with disabilities. And also, you know, I think we've seen in our work how sometimes voucher proponents will initiate a small voucher program to get a foot in the door, and then eventually expand until you really have a dual system of education in a state. So there's a question about the impact of school choice policies on students with disabilities who are students of color on that particular population, and a question about you know, how to counter the argument that vouchers, you know, are the best option for students with disabilities when it's really an equity issue for students who don't have the resources that they need in public schools, and so how to respond to those points is a question.
I haven't seen the latest research on this, but I would suggest that one way to look at this is to understand that it's a little, it's similar to medical needs, educational needs in this regard. The fact is there is a level of expenditure that has to be made for it to be a real educational assistance. But the most expensive is not always the best. And I think, you know, in the medical field, we've seen very convincing policies that it's how it's delivered is more important than the price tag of what's charged for the delivery. I say this because generally what people think about is that there are some private schools that have been specializing in this, that if you have $25,000 to $30,000, your child will get a pretty good special education. That's a price tag that exists. But the fact of the matter is, what we have in special needs is, as a sector, that public schools are not perfect about it, but they're more capable in terms of those who have the credentials and the resources to deal with the special needs of each child. I can't give you an answer as to why in an individual case it's better to send a child to a public school with special needs. I had a child in early years, and I was not particularly satisfied in years with the public school's approach to his education. But the fact, what I learned from that was that if I had been able to be the superintendent and to have enabled the special needs teachers to be working full-time instead of part-time, to have a caseload that was half of what they were having to deal with, my boy would have had a better chance at getting year in and year out the education I thought he needed. So it gets back to one simple thing. The public school system is more capable as a sector to dealing with it. If it had the resources, it would probably be more effective in doing it.
Thanks, Steve. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and we have a comment and a question that get at something that Sybil raised during the conversation, which is the comment is from Susan, and Susan notes that most of the people she knows use vouchers for private schools. Most of those folks are good white liberals. They have Black Lives Matter signs in their yard, and she and her family are one of the few families who send their children to public schools. And this is an area, she notes, where there doesn't seem to be a conservative liberal divide. But Ellen asks about this new podcast, Nice White Parents, which is on my list. I haven't heard it, but I understand that it's about really the power that white parents have and how they might externally advocate for integrated, diverse schools. They actually don't make decisions to send their children to those schools. And so Ellen asks if you all have listened to this podcast, and, you know, curious if you all have any closing thoughts about, you know, really how we reach all folks that we need to reach, including those nice white parents, about this movement and the fight to keep public funds in public schools.
I haven't had an opportunity to listen to the podcast. I've had an opportunity to read about it and hear some people comment about it. But I guess the observation I would make is the observation of my parents, my brother and I, making the decision to be a part of the school desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. That was a decision that was being made in support of a value and a vision that we not only had as a family, but a value and a vision for what we thought America should be, what we thought the world should be. And so I think that what strikes me is that we've lived in such a time in what's good for our individual children trumps everything. I'm sorry to use that. And we've got to get back to the place that we began to think about what are the sacrifices that people who believe better than we see in our society, what are the sacrifices they're willing to make, and how are they going to have some skin in this game?
I couldn't say it any better or with more reality and eloquence. I would reiterate only that we strategically, I think we have to fight different battles in different ways. And the first battle I think we need to fight is telling folks who send their kids to private schools that it ought not be with public funds. And we fight that battle. And once we get the public funds out of the private schools, then the next step is, I think, we talk about exactly the sacrifices. And then it's not, you know, it's not a big sacrifice. We have to learn that doing something for our community may, in fact, be the best thing to do for our children.
That's excellent. Thank you. Yes.
Lynn notes, I think, on behalf of all of us, brilliant response, Sybil, and thank you both so much for this really engaging and meaningful conversation. It was really an honor to host you all, and the webinar will be up on our website in the coming weeks, and please share it out more widely. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but this was a really engaging group, and thanks for joining us today.